see you, Jack Meeks. Many of you know Jack is famous for being the husband of Joanne Tredenick. But also pretty much a lifelong Jacksonvillian, right, Jack?
Almost.
Yep, you got it. That sounds good.
I came here, I like to brag now, 50 years ago.
50.
Right out of college. So that begins to tell my age.
Yes. And you and your wife live in historic Springfield, where you have done many amazing things, as well as in the urban core.
Yes, we live just a few blocks from here, and when it's not 100 degrees, or I don't want to look something, so I'm not going to look sweaty, we can actually walk to church. It's only 6 or 8 blocks or so. But today, at my insistence, we drove to church.
Well, when I often want to know more about this city, I think of calling Jack. That's one reason he's here today. And this is Randy Reaves, who we are blessed to have, who is president of the Jacksonville Police Union. Is that right? Yes?
That's correct.
And we are grateful that you're here.
Yep.
So I want to pretty much step back and let the two of you do your magic, but what we want to talk about today is particularly gun violence in the city of Jacksonville. What is going on here in our location, and how can we understand the complexity of this issue and how it drives a lot of the violence of our city and the things that we need to pray about as a community. So thank you, Jack, for being here and talking with Randy this morning for us.
Well, one thing I want to do first is I want to ask Dean Kate a question.
Okay.
She and I, a few weeks ago, went to this facility. It's a charity that this mother and daughter have over on a little north and west of here. And if you haven't seen this, it's on Myrtle Avenue, I think. Was that right?
I think so.
Myrtle Avenue?
Yeah.
Not far from Stanton High School. Anyway, they have accumulated, when they had permission to do so, billboards with names of people who in our city have been killed in gun violence. And I know it made an emotional impression on me. And when you and I went together, because you'd not seen it before, nor heard of it, I think. So just tell us how that felt to you, and you got to meet the lady who runs it as well.
This is a beautiful nonprofit that is designed to care for families who lose a loved one to gun violence. And it started by a woman whose son died, and what an amazing thing to do. But yes, they have names upon names upon names. It's a little bit like the Vietnam War Memorial. And when you see it, it's overwhelming. I think we tend to categorize, we take one death at a time, but to see them all together, I myself feel overwhelmed by this issue and can't understand why this country hasn't figured it out, why our streets are so dangerous as opposed to other countries in this world. And because we are such an amazing country with such resources, why haven't we been able to keep our cities safer? So I'm glad you all are here today.
Well, a couple of things, and Eric really led into this, that there were a couple of things he particularly mentioned that I thought are pertinent to us as Christians and how we relate to all of this. And one thing he said was that we were supposed to treat all with dignity and respect. And so often it seems that when I read about what's happening in our city with gun violence, it's happening to someone else. And yet, these things have been a whole lot more personal and real to me than they were for the first 30 or so years I was in Jacksonville. Joanne and I bought our home in historic Springfield just a little over 20 years ago. And thankfully, our neighborhood has improved a whole lot since then. We could not have survived without JSO, I'll tell you that. And the city, other than JSO, was oftentimes absent. But I like to tell people that prior to moving to our neighborhood, I'd never been shot at before. And I was telling the truth, Jenny, when I told that a few minutes ago. I'd never been shot at before. I'd never had a brick thrown through our window before. By the way, it was one of our 1890 wavy glass historic windows.
Oh, God.
And I'd never had my car tire slashed before. So this started giving me an involvement with the city that I just never had before. I never needed to go to the city administration or a city council person for anything, living in what I later heard described as a protected neighborhood versus living in an unprotected neighborhood. And so we've had an experience of living in, sometimes you'll hear this term, I didn't make it up, that Jacksonville is a tale of two cities. Well, we've had an experience of living in the other part of that tale of two cities. Now, recently, I was involved in some more political efforts and learned more about our city and met a lot of interesting, neat people whom I want to stay in contact with, whom I otherwise wouldn't have met. One of whom is my friend here with me today, Randy Reaves, who's had a JSO career and is now the president of our police union here in town. So this is going to be a little bit ad hoc. We've talked about it, but I'm sure whatever we talked about is not all that's going to come up today. Right. So as a start, tell us how, in your career, how you've intersected with gun violence in our city and some of the perceptions you have of things that are going to be happening now and in the future.
All right. Well, first, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here. Always happy to come out and talk, and thanks for being here to listen. I've been here 17 years with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. I've worked in all different areas of the agency, whether it be patrol. I was even saw that one of your members here is Angela Corey, who was a state attorney here for a long time. I worked for her at the state attorney's office as a detective. So speaking of subject matter experts, she is one of them here in town, and she would be a great source of resource for everyone here to listen to her insight. Myself, I promoted to a sergeant and was over a task force of 6 or 7 officers that was deployed every day to attack gun violence over on the west side of town. We were not a reactive group. That means if you call the police for your house getting broken into or a car being stolen, we don't respond to that. Our main job was to go into high crime, violent areas and to get illegal guns out of the hands of felons and criminals that were going to use them.
Wow.
So I can tell you, I took a lot of people on ride-alongs, and I encourage everybody, I always encourage everybody, you want to really see firsthand what's going on in your community. Talk to the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. They will set you up with somebody. You can ride along with a police officer. And I can tell you, it really opens your eyes to what's going on in this community. There's no better way to see what's truly going on than to get into a seat with a police officer and go through a tour of duty. And we took a lot of people on ride-alongs. To be able to tell you, you'd be shocked to know that in less than a year, and we work 5 days on, 5 days off, in less than a year, we took over 120 guns off the streets just on the west side of town. And to know that many weapons is going around in the hands of felons and criminals is kind of alarming to a lot of people. But I can tell you that it's out there. And it's something that we have to do our best to make sure that those individuals that are willing to use those weapons illegally and hurt and kill other individuals, sometimes innocent individuals as well, that we got to do the best we can to get them off the street and keep them off the street. But like me and Jack have always talked about, and it's not just a law enforcement problem, and that's the biggest issue. There's so many other things that we can do before these individuals get to the age of 20 or 25 or 30, where they're in a life of crime. They're using these guns. You have to get them when they're 6, 7, 8 years old and give them opportunities and steer them in other directions. And so it's not just, hey, let's see how many people we can put in jail, and hey, let's just concentrate on the law enforcement aspect. There's a lot of different aspects that we need to look at as a city.
You just mentioned the other day too, and maybe talk about this a little bit, how there's efforts going on now to look at how we allocate our JSO force based on the crime statistics and those things. That might be, I think, a good thing to talk about a little bit.
Yeah, so throughout my whole career, we've always had the same subsectors, the same zones. We've been broken up, and everybody you've been in Jacksonville long enough, I've been here my whole life. Jacksonville looks a lot different today than it did 10 years ago, 20 years ago. We've grown exponentially. The Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, the staffing has not grown exponentially. We are severely understaffed. I would argue that our members are severely underpaid. I'm proud to represent, because that's what we do as a fraternal order of police. We represent the men and women that are on the street. Not the chiefs and directors, but the men and women that are on the street that are out there working every single day. We have a very young agency, but we have some great men and women that are out here to protect, and they do a great job being as understaffed as they are. But what Jack talking to, Sheriff Waters, who I believe has been doing a great job, took and looked at all the data when he became sheriff. And that data was, what areas of town are we seeing an uptick in violent crime? What areas of town are we seeing uptick in calls for service? People trying to call the police that need help here. His staff looked at all that data, and they are reorganizing their whole way they look at their maps and their districts. They're going to call them districts now. And what they're doing is they're shrinking down what responsibility each officer will be responsible for. The thought process is on that you have more likelihood to get to know those people in maybe a 10-block area or a 20-block area. And some officers will have bigger areas than others, but they're doing it all based off data. And so that officer will be able to handle so many calls in that area, but then also have time to stay in that area to build relationships. It goes a long way. So if you are free, July 19th, Sheriff Waters is having an event at the Prime Osborne. His staff is putting on a huge presentation to show the city the new maps, what that staffing is going to look like. Again, this is just another technology piece that we're using to try to give the community better service, still being so severely understaffed. So I think it's really a good thing. We hope that this helps to combat the violent crime and the gun crime, but it is a big step in the right direction.
Well, at the risk of being too much of a CPA, I do want to put a little more context into some of what Randy was saying. Really, I guess starting 8 years ago, I was on the Sheriff's Task Force when Sheriff Wiggins first got elected, and I was on the Resource Task Force and began to look at a variety of things, hear a variety of things, be able to talk to people who were subject matter experts in the field. And then more recently, I really looked much harder than I ever had at our city financial statements, our audited financial statements, our budgets, our actuarial reports. And had a lot of conversations with Randy and others in JSO and our firefighters. And here are 2 or 3 or 4, however many I end up with, I think critical pieces of financial or numerical data that gives more of a context of where we are in this city. For instance, I don't know how many of you get the TU every day or pick it up, but last Sunday, Nate Monroe had an article in there talking about a variety of things, and he mentioned that in the 8 years and our previous mayor, that the budget had gone up for the JSO from roughly $400 million to $500 million, and that was a big increase. Well, what he didn't consider was the growth in our population and our inflation rate. I think all of us know we've had some inflation. Well, I looked at the Consumer Price Index, and our inflation rate over that period of time has been about 28%. And I made a best estimate I could of our population. We went from about 850,000 people 8 years ago to about 1 million people. So when I looked at the per capita amount that we're spending in JSO, that number, as best I could determine, somebody else I'm sure could get this a little tighter, was about $600 per person in Duval County, inflation adjusted. Now, in the budget that at least Nate talked about for $500 million, it's about $500 per person, which gives a lot different look at where we are and where we're spending money and what we're really doing. And I've heard consistently in the conversations we've had and I've had with others that we're about a third under national averages of police officers per thousand of population, about a third. And that doesn't consider, even though a lot of our 850 square miles in Duval County are pine trees, that doesn't really consider the fact that we're getting compared to cities who are much smaller from a geographical standpoint and don't have 850 square miles to take care of. So one of the aspects of that is, from all the conversation that I've had, our officers go from call to call to call, every hour, and so, or all their 8 hours or so that they're on the job. One of the things I talked to former Sheriff Glover some months ago that he was proud of was community policing that they do, or they did. And I think what you're going back to is starting to move in that direction. Well, all of us know that we can't have relationships with people. Community policing is supposed to be having relationships with people without spending time together. And so,
So building communities is incredibly important, and that sounds like a promising thing, those maps. Yeah, that sounds very promising. Redistricting in a sense, yeah.
Right, yeah, and that's the hope, that we're able to concentrate one officer in a smaller area to make those relationships. But the issue that Jack touched on with staffing, it's very hard to have officers having the time to make those relationships when you are so understaffed that you're bouncing around and you're barely, I know Jack can talk about it. You know, you might call the police for something that you think is very serious, and it might be a priority 2 or a priority 3 call, but at the end of the day, you might have 3 priority 1 calls in front of you. So I think Jack has a personal experience where he was in a potential violent situation and took over an hour for a police officer to respond. You know, a lot of people get upset with our officers. It's not our officers' faults. They're going to go. You have no idea what other kind of calls they're being sent to, and it's very tough to fully be invested in community policing when you're so understaffed.
Exactly. But Jack, tell me, from a lay perspective, how do these, like, he got 120 guns off the street. How do those guns get on the street, and how can we stop making guns so accessible? Is there a way to do that?
Well, I would say when we look at it, because Jacksonville, even though we are a city and we're growing, but this has happened all across the United States. We can see it. Some of your cities with the strictest gun laws, because a lot of people say, hey, let's just make it illegal. Well, I'm here to tell you, I was on the street, you know, crack cocaine's illegal, and it's out there all the time. Criminals are going to find a way to put their hands on guns and to get guns. The city of Chicago has some of the strictest gun laws in the United States, yet they have some of the highest violent crime rates with use of guns. So I truly believe the long-term play that we have to do is we have to have a multifaceted approach. While law enforcement is here trying to put away the people that are at 20 and 25 and 30 years old that have used guns and have shown that they're going to continue to use guns, we have to have another arm at a very young age and give them opportunities. Not only just teach them and mold them, and you know, if they're missing something at home with their family, the community has to surround them and try to give them opportunities. And a lot of these hot spot areas, are coincide with the highest poverty rates in the city. I don't think that's something that can be overlooked. And I think there's a lot of things that happen when someone's through junior high or high school, that they have avenues that, as a community, we should show them avenues to a job and to a good wage, another opportunity out of the path that they're on.
You hear the term community a lot in this, don't you?
Well, and it really is, because I've heard this other term, and I heard it in some of the debates, the 2 candidates who were in the runoff for sheriff, about a comprehensive approach to crime. And so one thing that's probably worth mentioning, I think most everyone has probably seen that our new mayor now, she has now taken office, has a number of transition committees. And I'm on one. I brought this up here so I can make sure that I read it appropriately. So I'm on the Public Safety Committee, and then that got split up into subcommittees, and I'm on the Community Engagement and Crime Prevention, and then that got further split up, and there are 2, there's another fellow in me, a retired JSO officer, and so we have recidivism. I have a hard time saying that word, recidivism, and reentry that we're supposed to address. And in that same public safety, there's also a subcommittee on literacy, and most of you probably were here in Jacksonville some years ago when we had the Jacksonville Journey, and that really did seem to be reducing violent crime. And then it got, I think during Alvin Brown's tenure, substantially, if not almost completely, defunded. And so one of the things that subcommittee is looking at is what's it called, the Kids Hope Alliance. What are they doing versus what the Jacksonville Journey did and what's being left out and what should we bring back in. Now, most any of us who've had much experience in Jacksonville know that we're the place where reports go to die. And so I'm hopeful our committee is supposed to have a report by September the 5th. So I'm hopeful that this will be a report along with the other transition committees where something is really done. Randy, I want to go back to you. I'm going to talk a little bit finances again. We talked, you brushed on the fact that we're not necessarily competitive with what we pay, and that officers, particularly if they have some experience, and we have, from everything I've heard, an outstanding program to train new officers. Come here for a while, go someplace else, and get better pay. Well, one of the aspects of that is that we used to have, until I guess 8 years ago or so, we used to have a defined benefit pension plan for our officers. Now it's a defined contribution plan. And I want you to expand on this, but what I've heard is that we just can't recruit, obtain, and retain the officers we need to have without a defined benefit plan. So tell us more about that, if you would.
Yeah, so it's 5 years ago, we switched our retirement benefits to a defined contribution plan. Right now, the industry standard, whether it be corrections or police, the industry standard is a pension system all over the state of Florida, really all over the nation. So a couple things have hurt us when it comes to hiring and recruiting people. Not only is it the pay and the retirement benefits, but over the last 3 years, the national attack on the law enforcement profession has really narrowed down the pool of applicants that are willing to come and put a gun and badge on. And I can argue that for good reason. There's been a lot of examples across the nation. I don't know how many people want their sons and daughters right now to get into a law enforcement career with what they've seen on TV the last 3 or 4 years. So here in Jacksonville, it's hurt us a little bit worse because we switched away from a defined benefit. We don't have a pension anymore. We also have dropped down in salaries. So as that's happened at the same time of our pool of applicants has gone down, we have started to see a very big slowdown in hiring, especially on our corrections side. Right now, we're about 190 vacancies on corrections. That means we have 190 budgeted spots that do not have human bodies in them. On the police side, we're around 40 to 50 of budgeted spots where we do not have human bodies taking those spots. So we hear about all this, hey, let's add new positions. The one issue with that is if you added 100 new positions today, then we're 150 short. If you added 200, then we're 250 short. The fact is we have to make sure that we get our package to a level to where we can attract and retain individuals in this field. So.
Wow.
Well, to go a little bit further with some financial matters, I was at a political rally or event some time ago, and there was a lot of talk, and people cheered about all the things that we wanted to be better in Jacksonville. We want to be safer. We want to have better infrastructure. And there was a variety of other things, have our parks taken care of better. And just for the heck of it, I asked the question, how many people want to pay more taxes? And I got a loud round of, no, I don't want to do that. And so one of the things that came out of my being on the Sheriff's Task Force 8 years ago was that we've really run this city on the cheap for a lot of years. And one of the more interesting schedules that was given to me, I always like to say when somebody gives me a schedule, it may look reasonable, but I haven't audited it. So I think this was factual. I got a schedule that showed back in the early 1990s, we still had more assets. I think it was about $10 million or so, or more assets than we had liabilities in our whole city pension, defined benefit pension plan. And over a 20-year period or so, that small plus went to a negative of, I think it was 1.5 or $1.6 billion because we hadn't paid what we were supposed to pay towards that pension plan. We took holidays, and over a lot of that period of time, we cut our tax rates. And so most of us would probably think, if we hadn't actually looked at some of this stuff, that the pension plan, or pension problems were solved with this future increase or the future sales tax we'll get when the Better Jacksonville plan is paid for. Well, in fact, in the ensuing 8 years, that liability has gone from $1.5 or $1.6 billion to about $3.1 billion. And so we have this interesting combination of a growing deficit and the closed pension plan by about $200 million a year, and yet we need to go back to a defined benefit plan for our officers. So one of the things we've talked about, and expand on this, how we would think about trying to get into the state retirement system as opposed to our Jacksonville system, which since we've demonstrated we can't run a plan like that as we've talked about. So
Yeah. So, good.
Well, wait one second, Ben. If we're going to start questions, then we need a microphone. All right. Let's let him finish what he was saying, and then we'll take the question. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, what was the, we were talking
We're
about?
talking about
The Florida retirement system.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the industry standard here, when we look at other agencies across the state and the people that we're losing our employees to, everybody is in FRS. That's the Florida retirement system. The state of Florida runs that. That truly is the mechanism, the retirement mechanism that's used for correction officers, police officers all across the state of Florida.
firefighters too, I
And
think.
firefighters as well, our teachers. So that, we believe, is the best landing spot for our new police officers, and it's something that would bring us up to par to where then we could start pulling people from these other agencies, getting experienced officers to come here in Jacksonville.
Oh, thank you. Okay, Ben, go ahead.
We saw in the news recently where a police officer shot a young man in the head in Paris, France, and they're protesting. We see that happening here in the United States too, okay? And then we see people respond to that. And then when we talk about guns and so forth, the politicians a lot of times use it as a political platform, the Second Amendment. And I think personally that the Second Amendment is being exploited, because I think that the government could have some control over the types of guns that private citizens have over against private citizens having all kinds of guns, especially the ones where they can shoot for 30 or 40 rounds, you know, yeah. And when I look at the Second Amendment, where it talks about, we should have a well-regulated militia. Now, that was years ago. Well, we have the military, we have National Guards, and all that all across the country, yeah. So I think we could reduce this concept of the type of guns that private citizens can own to defend themselves, instead of these guns with lots of rounds where they can kill lots of people, and we see that happening. It's like, I think we have more than we do the days of the year here in the United States. And then I see it happening it happened in Germany, it even happened in Russia also. So, and then another thing is that what percentage of, I think it goes both ways to a certain extent, what percentage of police officers use their fire weapons inappropriately?
You asking what they use them inappropriately? Yeah, no, I would say, and I will say, the members that we defend and our members, when a police officer is involved in a deadly force situation, they use their firearm. They are investigated not only by the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, they're investigated by the State Attorney's Office, they're investigated, the medical examiner plays a role in that. And then if anything is deemed outside, the Department of Justice can come in and take over. Our members, when they are put in a situation where they're forced to use deadly force, I would argue have a fine-tooth comb over that case multiple times. And it's a sad situation when our officers have to use deadly force. And I respond to every police-involved shooting here in Jacksonville. I can tell you it is a traumatic event for a lot of our officers that have to do that and have to use deadly force. But here in Jacksonville, I'm proud of how our guys are trained and what they've done. And I think the record speaks for itself.
Mm-hmm.
Randy, something else, and you might know these figures more than I do. But I've seen them before. We start with, I think it's over 1 million calls a year in Jacksonville. And then very, very high percentage of that are calls will handle without any need to use force of any kind. And then there's some where people have to be arrested and some level of force. But when you get down to how many times out of that, starting with, I think it's 1 million or so, that a police officer here in Duval County actually has to use a gun, it's down to a tiny, tiny fraction of 1%.
Yeah, it's very small, and I think something else that Sheriff Waters did that I really was happy to see, I think he's doing a great job doing it, is his transparency. For too long, we have a police-involved shooting, and because of all those investigations going on at the same time, the agency and people would not comment on those shootings. The public would be left in the dark on what happened. What that did was, over those months, there's a small segment of this city would spin falsehoods and false negatives to try to paint the officer as doing something wrong. Fast forward 6 months when the investigation's over, we then see that a lot of those things that were being said hours and days after this police-involved shooting happened, none of that happened to be true. So now with body-worn cameras and technology, Sheriff Waters is releasing these body-worn cameras for the public to see. And a lot of them are pretty traumatic. A lot of them are, they're not for kids to view. But I do think it's a very good thing in the fact that the public can now see what our officers are facing every single day. And if it was your son or daughter out there wearing a gun and badge trying to protect the community, you get a bird's eye view. You get the same view they get of what they encounter and why they had to use deadly force in that situation. And I think that is very positive for the community to be able to see that.
Yeah, Randy, it's a great example of how there certainly have been instances in this nation of police officers that have abused that power. And the media blows that up, but we have to be careful because we have a lot of officers that are doing good every day. And it's easy to sort of categorize when you see something atrocious, which has happened. But we do have a lot of people that put their lives at risk and who are underpaid and need our support as citizens.
Yeah. I can say there's a lot of misconduct throughout the nation. I talk to a lot of union presidents from all our major cities. A lot of the stuff that you see, something that happens in Missouri from a undertrained police department that's hiring anybody that wants to be a police officer. 5 years later, that individual commits a crime wearing a gun and a badge. It affects every single person that wears a gun and a badge. But I argue that, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office and the standard that they have is very hard to find another agency that has as high of a standard as we have. And I think that's a good thing. And we need to make sure that we keep that standard where it's at. And again, the national media pushing out those stories need to be heard, but not everyone needs to be judged based off of what happened somewhere else.
We do have a couple more questions, but Ben had one more point that's worth addressing. These automatic weapons, how is it possible that civilians can purchase them? I mean, I'm married to an ICU doctor who, teenagers shooting themselves in the head, and he has to handle that. How are these people getting their hands on guns so easily, and is there a way that we can prevent that from happening?
Yeah, I know on a federal level, that's a hot topic issue.
Yeah.
And, our officers, the way we look at it, the law has just changed here in Florida for concealed carry. I don't know if people know that. It just started in July.
I don't. Tell us what happened.
So you no longer now have to have a concealed weapons permit to carry a concealed firearm.
Oh. Great.
Yeah. So you are going to have more individuals carrying firearms. Now, the way we look at it is, you look at some active shooters incidents, you see shootings in banks or shootings wherever, where armed citizens, good citizens that are trained with their firearm, stop a deadly threat. Mm-hmm. And the fact is, they save lives when that happens. I believe you go back to Chicago, the strictest gun laws in the United States, and it has the highest gun violence in the United States. Yeah. So I think we can't just say we have to outlaw something and then it's all of a sudden, hey, let's outlaw it, we move on, problem solved. There's other things that we have to do, and I think educating the youth, getting out of poverty, I believe.
Absolutely. All
Giving
that's
those,
important.
all that is important to where it's not just the gun, it's let's give that individual that's pulling that trigger.
Yeah.
And then mental health is something that's huge that we haven't touched on.
Totally.
And I think mental health is one of the biggest problems and issues that we have in the United States
Absolutely.
today.
I still struggle with those automatic weapons, though. I don't see why they're even invented. Okay, other questions? We had a couple of them up here. Oh, we have a lot. Okay, starting on this side, Eric, and then we'll move over to Ginny, and then I think we had Marielle? Yeah. Sorry, Nancy, I started on the opposite end of the room.
She needed the extra steps, right? Wanted the extra steps. Yeah, my name's Eric Call, and I had a deacon at my church in Miami, Coral Gables, who was also a licensed police officer. And just to make a comment to your point, is that when he was on scene at a crime and guns were drawn, he said it was interesting a number of citizens, civilians, who wanted him to shoot before he wanted to shoot. Because they wanted to stop whatever was going on, just to comment. And he pointed out to me that you would not believe how many times that happens when they show up on the scene, that they want to use the police to solve their problems if they can't solve it themselves, which was an interesting comment. But I think that the focus on the police is often overblown compared to the numbers of gun violence on the street, person to person. And I think that the issue, and not that that's not important, but in the city of Jacksonville, this is kind of a question. What is the percentage of, the number, let's say, of the times a police officer has to shoot as opposed to the actual shooting of one person to another in the city and the county? Question.
Civilian to,
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know exact percentages. I can tell you we can be, depending on the year, we could be in the teens when it comes to police-involved shootings. That's what you're asking about. I think the murders have ranged in the last 4 or 5 years to 200 all the way down to right under 100 in the last 5 years. So somewhere in that range, I think 177 or 160s.
so 4 or
Or
5
last year.
times up to 10 times as many, more civilian to civilian.
Yeah, I mean,
than-
obviously, yeah. I mean, the civilian on civilian gun violence is
Much greater.
and than it is with police.
Yeah. Yes, yes. Yeah, that is the greater issue. Jack and then Mary Ellen. Go ahead, Jack.
Eric, I just want to agree with you on that. And certainly our focus in this transition group is more about those things and the underlying issues. I read something yesterday I thought that was really good. It says, to produce evil, and I would recommend, or I guess submit to you those boards we saw are a function of evil.
Yes, yes.
To produce evil, the ground must be fertilized. And then this goes to what Randy's also mentioned. And some of the fertilizers are poverty, deprivation, and neglect. And this tale of two cities, we've got a substantial amount of our city that's been neglected.
Amen to that. Amen to that.
I am in full support of breaking the cycle of violence, starting with the young children.
Yes.
And I don't know if you're familiar with the book, The Other Westmore. The current Westmore is the governor of Maryland, and he grew up in the same neighborhood in Baltimore as another Westmore, who is now in prison for murder. And the book is a parallel of their lives and the support they had, even though they grew up a couple of blocks from each other in a bad neighborhood.
That sounds very powerful. Refers to what Randy was talking about.
My question, though, is what impact does the NRA have on
The NRA,
what you
what impact?
do,
On what we do?
trying to break the gun violence?
Yeah. So we've had on a state level, so the Fraternal Order of Police has a state organization. We're also national. We're the biggest national union for police officers in the United States. So we have our lobbyists, and we lobby on the federal level. We lobby on the state level. We've had our issues with the NRA. I mean, we've had our battles with the NRA. And we've had agreements with the NRA. But I can tell you, they're very powerful. They were more powerful 10 to 15 years ago than they are today. You know, they're there to protect their rights, and sometimes it goes over. They wanted to try to pass legislation for open carry, to allow people to openly carry firearms, not concealed carry, that's different. Open carry, that means you could be walking into the store and there's somebody with a pistol strapped to their side that's not a police officer. They wanted in that legislation to where when our officers couldn't even stop that person and talk to them about having their firearm. And that was something that we pushed back against. We thought that was bad, not only for our officers, we felt like that was bad for the community. So we have our battles with them. We were able to get that to where that didn't get passed in legislation, thank goodness, but that was just one example of an issue that we had going back and forth.
That's interesting. Ginny, you had a question, and then there was one over here.
Tell us where they're doing it well in a city that's of 1 million people. Where are some good examples?
A good example here is in Florida. And I don't know the exact percentages, but I know Miami has fully tried to staff their law enforcement. They have seen a reduction in crime in Miami. So I think they are doing it well. But you hit it on the head. This is not something that Jacksonville's new to. Jacksonville is growing into a major city. And as they grow into a major city, we're going to see the same issues and the same problems that we see in other major cities throughout the United States. So I think Miami, the mayor down in Miami has hired a lot more police officers. They've been pretty proactive, trying to get out in front of saying, hey, the way he looked at it was safety was the #1 reason I got voted in. I'm going to do everything I can to try to keep these communities safe. And he's done that. I still think you just can't do that. There's other things that you have to be able to do to where you stop this problem for the next decade, the next few decades.
It's a multifaceted approach.
Overnight.
Yes.
Well, let me go back to one more.
Okay, go ahead.
One more thing too, is since I keep emphasizing the money about this, when we did this report 8 years ago for the Sheriff's Resource Task Force, one of the things that we said is that Jacksonville we'd run our city on the cheap for a lot of years. And certainly we have some efficiencies by being a consolidated city. And I looked at the numbers then, and I couldn't figure out Orlando, Orange County for some reason, but as best I remember, 8 years ago, we had roughly $1 billion budget. And if we had been taxed as Tampa Hillsborough was, or Miami-Dade, and I forget which one was the higher of the two, we would have had on that $1 billion budget another $150 to $250 million a year.
Wow.
Well, that could have done all sorts of things, from activating parks better, cleaning up infrastructure and other issues in the elected neighborhoods, having enough officers on the streets. So one of the speculations I have is our new administration, and we've talked about this a lot, in a lot of ways, financially, we've kicked the can down the road in this city. And I was talking to someone about it the other day, and the person said, well, I wonder if it's become a barrel that we can't kick down the road anymore. And you and I have talked a lot about that, and I wonder if this administration isn't going to have to deal with our financial kicking the can down the road and the impact it's going to have starting on public safety.
Thank you.
Okay, I do understand that this is a very complex issue, so I have a few statements to make. Perception, all right? So we live in the South Bank, and typically we don't have the crime that happens in the north. We do have some nuisance crime, right? However, the only time that we believe that we have too many police officers is when the Jaguars are playing, right?
That
All
we
of a
have
sudden,
too many when the
yeah,
Jaguars?
too many. I mean, there are
Okay.
tons of police officers out there that are definitely, they're directing traffic. Okay. So we lived in a lot of different cities and countries around the world, and they don't have these type of problems. But what seems to have happened is that the community, government, police got together and came out with I believe to be, it's not a perfect model, but a better model, right? There are different problems that need to be solved by different skills. We talked about the mental part.
Yes.
We talked about the traffic control and stuff like that. And unfortunately, what seems to be happening in Florida is that the only thing that we hear is that this infamous, to stop a bad guy with a gun, you need a good guy with a gun. And then we hear, well, we want more money, right? And to your point, you already have a lot of money that you're not spending, okay? So why do you want more money? So
I didn't say that, but
no, but it's it's one of the things. So now, out of all that, I don't, unless I'm reading the wrong papers, I do not feel that there is a police unity statement that is made that to your point, you're out there in the streets, you know what's happening. That doesn't seem to be coming across from a voice of a policeman, right? That said, this is really our challenge, okay? This is what help we need versus we need more officers. The more officers will come if people understand the issue, and I don't think people do that right now.
So what you're saying is, how can we hear more of a voice from the police force
Yes.
as to what they need?
Correct.
Yes.
And the only thing we hear about, T.K. Water got elected because he's going to have more officers, right?
Right.
And so on, which is probably unfair, okay? But then we don't have, even at election time, we don't really hear the office, the union, or whatever it is coming through and say, we want politicians with the people that help us solve this problem. Okay.
Okay.
So,
Randy, what do you have to say?
Yeah,
about
so I agree with that. Communication can always be better. I think if the citizens saw the manpower issues that we have and the hurdles that our 24 and 25-year rookie police officers have to go through on a shift, they would be pounding the doors down to try to give more funding to the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, because they will see what a major city takes to actually police that. And I'll tell you, some of it, my officers, the guys that we represent, a lot of things get thrown at their feet that are not police and law enforcement, mental health being the first one. A law enforcement officer today has to be a police officer. He has to be a mental health professional. He has to be someone that can talk to two spouses that are about to kill each other, to be a therapist. And sometimes he has to be a father figure. Shows into some of the roughest areas of this town that have no father figures, and the police officer is wearing that hat. So they go from call to call to call, taking one hat off, put another hat on. If law enforcement officers were given the ability to just work in their arena as law enforcement officers, I think you could see the statistics. I know you would see the statistics go down when it comes to crime. Now, how that message gets out to the public, I think Sheriff Waters will do a bit better job of getting that message out. He's been pretty much on the forefront of not just doing a lot of media interviews and trying to get involvement through the community. The July 19th event is one thing. He's inviting everybody there. So I think that's a good thing. But I also think, there's only so much of that stuff. At the end, I go back to what I said at the very beginning. Concerned citizens, if you want to know what's going on in the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, I highly ask that you go and take 4-6 hours of your day and get into a squad car with a police officer and do a ride along. It really will open your eyes to see what's going on.
Thank you, Randy. George, and then Melissa, and then Suzanne.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Thanks for coming over today.
Thank you.
One thing that surprises me is that every year in Jacksonville, 100 or so guns are stolen out of cars. And I guess I have two questions. One is it people leaving their cars open, or are they getting broken into and stolen? And second of all, isn't there something we can do to make gun owners that bring guns into cars more responsible for the possession of that weapon, maybe punishing them for having lost it?
Right. Yeah. So first point, it's not 90% of them is not they're breaking your window and going and getting your guns. What it is it's people that go through a neighborhood, they try 200 doors, and they're just playing the numbers. Your door's unlocked, then they're going to get in. Hundreds of guns, I would say there's probably even way more than that. A lot of the times we have a gun that's used in a crime, comes back to an owner. We call that owner. oh yeah, I had that gun 3 years ago, and they get their gun stolen, they never report it stolen.
Wow.
Because they're really embarrassed that they let their gun sit in the car and get their gun stolen. Correct. Well, there's some people that would like legislation like that to hold them accountable for that. There you go. You got to vote right there.
You got to write that, George.
There you
That's
go.
right.
Yeah.
Melissa, and then,
Yep,
sorry,
go ahead.
Joel. Melissa and Joel, and then Suzanne.
Sorry, I have a question and a comment. The question is, has the Florida public sector retirement system in general switched to defined contribution? And the comment is, as a politico, I guess, it's disappointing when we talk about trying to do the mental health funding that it gets shorthanded as defunding the police. And so I guess we need to work on how we change the discourse around that, since we all know it needs to be more comprehensive.
100%. And the biggest thing with mental health, we are, as a union president of somebody that represents police officers, we need mental health help more than anything. The biggest facility of mental health is the downtown jail, and it should not be that way.
Yeah.
It puts a stress on understaffed correction officers, and it puts stress on my police officers that are on the street. But I can tell you, just like Jack said before, our budget is not where it needs to be. So when people come in and they say, hey, we want mental health, which we can all get behind, but we want to take that $50 million out of the police budget, the JSO budget, we can't, there's just no room for that.
Yep.
But I 100% am on board with getting new funding for mental health. We really dearly need it.
Let me talk numbers a little bit more on that and experience. All Joanne and I have to do to see people with mental health problems, or I like to say shipwrecked, all we have to do is walk outside our home, and particularly at this convenience store at 3rd and Main, which is 2 blocks from where we live. There are always shipwrecked people around that facility. And so my understanding is, maybe going back as far as the 60s, and certainly it picked up speed in the 70s and 80s, we substantially reduced our capacity in the mental health facilities with the notion that folks could be, in effect, mainstreamed and dealt with in a neighborhood setting. And we've seen that in our neighborhood, and for a lot of people, it just doesn't work. To some numbers I've read, again, I haven't audited these, but I've read them in what I think are credible sources. Florida is 49th in the latest numbers I've seen in per capita mental health spending. And the only reason we're not 50 is Arkansas didn't report. And then Duval County, depending on which article I've read, is either last per capita of all, 69 counties, or we're merely last of the metropolitan areas. So in Duval County, the atmosphere that you're working in, my friend,
Wow.
in terms of mental health funding, is we're at or near the bottom of the bottom in terms of per capita mental health spending. Now, I've had a CPA career, and I know that always spending more money isn't necessarily the right thing to do. But when I'm told the organization compared to other comparable entities are at the bottom of the bottom, then my first response is, we might need to think about spending more money. But
Amen to
again,
that.
where's it going to come from?
Yeah. Joel, and then Suzanne.
I'm interested in your taking the guns off the street. What are the prevalent crimes that are being committed with the guns where you are identifying these people? I understand how the geographic concentration will follow poverty lines, but what crimes are prevalent? Are they drug-related? Are they domestic, et cetera? And what sorts of typical arms or weapons are being used in those?
First, the weapons range from semi-automatic, fully automatic weapons, all the way down to mostly handguns. Drugs, you hit on something else that we haven't talked about. Drugs is probably the drug life is one of the main reasons why people have to arm themselves. If you're going to be involved in that life, if you're going to be selling narcotics and selling drugs illegally, it's very hard to do that without firearms. So that was a lot of it. A lot of it is the being involved in the drug trafficking, drug dealing, and that's the majority of what we came across. A lot of your shootings are drug related, drug trade related. If you have a competing drug dealer, you're not going to call the police to handle it. You have to handle that yourself. And that person has a gun, you have a gun. And that's how it ends up on the news, and that's how we end up with this murder rate, as going as high as it is. So drugs are another huge issue. Again, there's so many of them that we haven't even touched on, but drugs is one of the main ones.
Big one, yeah. Suzanne?
My comments are more than about Jacksonville. My comments are based on mass shootings, particularly the school shootings, the babies being shot in schools just tear me apart. We as a country have a problem. We in the world are killers. That's what we have set ourselves up as. If you look at the statistics, we're murderers. We need to, as a country, admit that we have, with our Second Amendment, allowed guns into the citizenry that have not used them responsibly. We need to acknowledge that the guns are the problem. The old saying is that guns don't shoot people, that people shoot people. But people can't shoot the guns if they don't have the guns. Maybe it is time not to have the Second Amendment. Maybe it is time to repeal the Second Amendment. Is it going to happen in 6 months? Is that going to remove the guns from the citizenry? Absolutely not. But I think it's time that we as citizens need to admit that we have a problem in our basic fundamental acceptance of this. We need to say, this is not what we stand for.
Thank you. Randy, what do you have to say to that?
I can tell you, I'm not in agreement with getting rid of the Second Amendment, so we would disagree there. Again, I go back to, as somebody that's been on the street where people have pulled guns and, we're being deadly encounters with individuals that are armed with guns. Again, to make it to outlaw guns, we've outlawed cocaine, we've outlawed everything, to just try to blanketly outlaw something and think that's going to fix the problem. Again, I go back to these major cities, Chicago and New York. There are a ton of guns in the city of Chicago, and it is as illegal as it can be to have a gun in Chicago. The criminal element, though it is a small percentage, the criminal element will always find their way to put their hands on guns or put their hands on drugs. So that's why I think we have to be more creative than to just say, hey, we got to outlaw something. That's just my opinion.
Lynn, Nancy, did you have something in the back? Nancy, right? No. Okay. Lynn?
This might be a naive question, but so over the last 2 or 3 decades, there are a lot of video games that are really violent. Do you know of any studies or any correlation between I'm a retired kindergarten teacher. I had 5-year-old kids who told me they were playing Mortal Kombat with their daddy. Is there any correlation between kids and young people playing those very violent games and then violence?
Yeah, I don't know any specifics. I can't speak to percentages or anything like that, but I can tell you that youth, teenagers, even in junior high, are being desensitized by first-person shooting games where it glorifies going around and murdering people. Your score goes up, and it triggers in your brain, now I've done something good and I've won. Grand Theft Auto is a game that's been very successful, widely played, and it glorifies going to be, you can select to be a criminal, you can go and prostitute women, you can go and deal drugs, you can go shoot and murder people, and your score goes up in that game. So yeah, I would say that is part of what we talked about over here. Our society has gone that far, and at what point in time is it too far?
Jack, any closing thoughts? We've touched on a lot here, and it's been really rich, and we've opened up the complexity of this issue, and drugs and video games and education, mental health. I mean, it is so vast. But what you got down to fundamentally, Jack, really was about money to start. That we need to be willing to step up to the plate and fund our city a little bit better than we have in the past.
Maybe more than a little bit better, depending on how hard we look at those numbers.
But in addition to paying, what else as citizens can we do? Randy and Jack, I loved, Randy, you talked a bit about community. Certainly being neighbors, keeping an eye on your neighbors, right? What are some of the other things we can do trying to be faithful in this broken world right now?
That is a big thing, and in some of our neighborhoods that have poverty, it's very tough for them to be willing to speak up because they're in fear of retaliation for good reason. They also don't want to speak up because they spoke up before and police have done nothing, whether it's because they ran into a police officer that wasn't a priority to them, or they're understaffed and they're not able to handle it. But as a community, groups like this, meeting together to roundtable things and to actually have the conversation, so many people, unless they live in those high poverty areas, they write it off as not my problem, not my issue, not on my front door. And as a community, we just can't keep doing that. And a lot of the things we see now, like Jack talked about, has a lot to do with a lot of the community has gone forgotten for a long time, and now these are the consequences of that. And I think just because we might live in South Mandarin and our car getting broken into is a traumatic event, they don't understand that over on the Northwest Quadrant, a traumatic event is losing a child to a drive-by shooting. And I think that's something that we have to, as a community, just not stand for, even though it's not on our front door.
Yeah.
I think to take that a little bit further, meeting as many people as I had from all over the city, it's a fair statement to say that we have a significant number of people in this city who are just traumatized. I've met people I met a pastor whose, his father and son were both killed in gun violence. God. I met a woman at one of the police presentations whose son and grandson were killed in police violence. So there's, and we as Christians are called to be our brothers and our sisters' keepers. We're called to do that. And I think there's so many different ways that we as Christians and as citizens of this community can interact with these issues. And it seems to me oftentimes our political system has been behind what people are doing in various charities and community functions that are so good. So if people have a heart for this kind of thing, there are all kinds of organizations to get involved in that touch all kinds of different aspects of the issues that we're dealing with.
So be willing to step up to the plate in terms of funding, be awake and aware of your neighborhood, and be willing to get involved and talk like we're doing today. And this has been wonderful. Thank you both so much. Let's give them a round of applause.